Thanks, Mark and Kate, for organizing this and for the introduction, and thanks everyone for attending. I'm going to be talking today about how we can learn from nature to manufacture sustainable materials. So I would like to first talk about the grand challenges. So grand challenges are questions that we as a humanity need to address over the coming years that are related to how we are going to feed the global population, how are we going to provide clean energy, how we are going to tackle climate change, and all these and other questions have been listed by different kinds of organizations. So for instance, here at UCL, we have our own UCL Grand Challenges, which are listed here on the left side of the screen. But also the United Nations have created this list of sustainable development goals. And many scientific and engineering organizations and also government organizations have created different sorts of lists. But the message across all of them is that we have several big issues that we need to address within the coming years to make sure that we keep the Earth as a habitable planet with social justice for everyone. So one way to deal or to try to tackle these grand challenges is being developed here at UCL, and it's a technique that has been pioneered over the past decade by the Center for Nature-Inspired Engineering. What this methodology does is it looks at the structure and the dynamics that we can find in natural systems, and we try to take inspiration from them to develop transformative solutions that we can use to address these grand challenges. So what the nature-inspired solutions methodology does is that it looks at the scalable architecture that we find, for instance, in trees or in lungs or in kidneys. We take a look at the optimized transport networks that they have that allow them to distribute nutrients, water, oxygen throughout its entire structure in a sustainable way. We also look at the collective dynamics of natural systems, how they self-organize, and how they are able to be robust, but also be able to adapt to changes in the environment. These are all desirable properties from natural systems, and we can take inspiration from them to tackle different kinds of grand challenges. And I'm not going to go here into the details of all these different figures that you see here, but my intention with this slide is to convey the breadth of areas in which a nature-inspired solutions methodology can be useful to address technological questions. So for instance, we can look at the structure of lands and take inspiration from them to develop optimized fuel cells for clean energy production. We can also look at the structure of cell membranes to create better filtration membranes for production of clean water. We can also look at nature's complexity and take inspiration from that to develop better cancer treatments, or to the structure of trees to develop better reactors for manufacturing, or even the veins and the structure of leaves to develop better catalysts for our chemical industrial processes. So with this, I just wanted to give a quick overview of the many different areas in which this nature-inspired solutions methodology developed here at the Center for Nature-Inspired Engineering at UCL can be applied. But we are here today to talk about materials. And the reason why I like materials and why I like to research materials is because I think that the solution to many of these grand challenges that I just described will be related to which material we choose to tackle those grand challenges. So that can apply for infrastructure, to engineering, to agriculture, to food, water, health. And luckily for us, I think we are now in a very unique time in history, because we have a convergence of 4 different factors. So the first one is that in terms of materials design, we can now understand and control the assembly and behavior and the structure of materials with very high resolutions that were not achievable just a few years ago. We also have new manufacturing techniques that allow us to make materials in shapes that we could never dream of also just a couple of years ago. with techniques, for instance, like 3D printing. We also have an increasing computational power that is allowing us to tackle the design of materials all the way from the atomistic scale to the macro, to the structural levels scale, by being able to simulate all these different levels, these different scales. And also, very importantly, life sciences are becoming increasingly quantitative, increasingly controllable. And this is allowing us now to incorporate organisms with pre-programmed functions into the formulation of new materials. So this convergence of 4 different factors is allowing us to now create materials in ways that were inaccessible to us just a couple of decades ago. But I'm generally interested in natural materials, and the way I usually like to explain this is by showing this picture that you can see here. So I would like to ask you to think about what is the most technologically advanced instrument that you can see here. So you see here a computer, a phone, a camera lens, a headset. So I would like you to think, what is the most technologically advanced instrument that you can see here? Now, I cannot see your faces or your replies, but my experience here is that then people start arguing that it's the computer because it has the largest set of tools and functions, and other people will say, well, the phone is the most advanced one because it's a miniaturized version of a computer. But I would argue that the most technologically advanced instrument that you see here is actually the plant. And the reason for me to say that is that if you think about the plant in comparison to all the other devices that we see in this picture, the plant is able to self-assemble. It can self-heal. It can self-replicate. It is renewable. It also senses and is able to respond to changes in the environment like temperature or light, and it's also not powered by electricity. So this is telling us that there is something we can learn from natural materials that we are still not able to replicate in our technological materials and devices. To give you a better or more detailed explanation about this, I'm showing here a problem that we usually have when we try to develop materials for engineering applications. So when we want to develop engineering materials, we are usually confronted with a toughness versus strength dichotomy. That means that we either make very tough materials or very strong materials. And if we want to develop materials that have a little bit of both features, or a little bit of toughness and a little bit of strength, then we usually end up achieving something on the lower end of what we would like to get. In contrast, nature has a lot of materials that are able to display at the same time very high toughness and very high strength. So this is telling us again that there is something that we can learn from the materials that we find in nature to bring the properties of our engineering materials for our technological applications into the realm of properties that natural materials have. To give you a little bit more granularity about this, I'm here again showing a graph that plots the same 2 properties, so toughness versus strength. And if you look at the lower right corner of this graph, you will be able to see a lot of natural materials like shells and tissue and bamboo and bone. And these materials display a much better combination of toughness and strength than many technical materials like foams or elastomers or ceramics or glasses. So this is again telling us that there is something we can learn from how these materials are made to improve the properties of our own engineering materials. For you to get a more quantitative feeling about this, I'm also showing here this table, and I would like to highlight 2 materials out of this table. One of them is silk, the spider silk that you can find in spider webs, and the other one is steel, one of the most common materials used in construction. If you look at the strength, they both have similar strengths. So they are both in the gigapascal range. But then if you look at extensibility and toughness, you will see that silk is able to outperform steel by many orders of magnitude. And for me, the most astonishing thing is that spider silk is able to achieve these properties by being synthesized at room temperature, at room pressure, in an aqueous environment with renewable feedstock. So it's not that we need high-pressure ovens or very expensive catalysts to produce spider silk. It is produced at ambient conditions. So this is, again, something that we are not able to replicate yet when we try to produce our own human-made materials. And the reason why natural materials and human-made materials display these different properties is because we and nature make materials in fundamentally different ways. So when we think about the materials that we make, we usually start with a top-down approach. That means that we go from the large scale to the small scale. So if you think about concrete, for instance, we start with a mine where we extract limestone, and then we reduce its particle size. We go from larger chunks to smaller and smaller sizes until we get to a cement powder that then we use to create concrete. The same would apply, for instance, if you think about wooden structures. We take a tree, then we chop down the tree, we cut small pieces, and then we assemble those small pieces into larger wooden structures. In contrast, nature makes materials in an entirely different way, in an opposite way, actually. So nature is actually a great non-engineer, because what it does, it starts at the very small scale, at the scale of atoms. It starts assembling materials atom by atom, and it goes all the way from the atomistic scale to the structures scale. And for me, the most astonishing thing about how nature makes materials is that it's able to make a large set of materials by combining weak and lightweight, very common universal building blocks. Those building blocks are the three blocks that you see here. Those are minerals, proteins, and sugars. And then depending on how those materials are combined, depending on how those materials are spatially distributed, nature is able to create a wide range of materials, either very small materials from very small materials like a tooth to very large materials like a tree, from very stiff materials like bone to very flexible materials like human skin. But it's all done by combining these three building blocks. I'm showing here now two figures of two materials that are impressive from nature. One of them is bone and the other one is wood. And the reason for me to show this is because I want you to be able to appreciate how, by building structures from the molecular scale all the way to the structures scale, you can create very delicate, very intricate structures, as the ones that you can see here. Now, from those building blocks that I mentioned a couple of slides ago, I am mostly interested in proteins. And the reason why I like proteins to make materials is because they are able to display these fancy structures that you can see here on the upper side of the left of the slide. So when you talk about proteins, a lot of people will think about food, like something that is healthy to eat. If you mention proteins to a biochemist, they will probably think about an enzyme that will biocatalyze a certain biochemical reaction. But in my case, I think about proteins as polymers, as biopolymers. So polymers that we can use to make materials. So actually, proteins display an important structural role in nature because they are one of the materials that constitutes the scaffolds, the structures in which cells and organisms live. So an interesting thing about proteins is that they are able to fold, to adopt a certain conformation in 3 dimensions. And you have probably seen this in the news or in papers where you see that proteins have like these helical regions, or they have turns or aligned beta sheets. And these different 3-dimensional structures are able to then create or are the nanoscale motifs that govern the macroscale properties of materials like the wings of insects, or our human skin, or spider webs, or the skin of squids. So all of these materials have in common that they are made from proteins. And these materials, if you think about them, they are impressive in terms of mechanical properties. For instance, the wing from insects is able to flap hundreds and hundreds of times per minute without breaking. If you think about a human-made material that would be asked to perform the same role, it will probably fail much earlier than the wing of insects does. Also, spider webs are also impressive materials. So if you think about spider web, it's made of very thin fibers, and still these fibers, these threads, are able to stop the fly, and they are able to withstand the impact of an insect that is several orders of magnitude larger than the diameter of these fibers, and still the material is able to stop those insects and not break, not fail. The reason why protein biopolymers are interesting is because they are very different from the polymers that we normally produce from fossil sources. So when we try to make polymers from fossil sources, what we usually have to use are polymerization reactions. So reactions in which we start with small monomers, the constituting units of our polymer chains, and we need to start aggregating one after the other. Now, these polymerization reactions are usually complicated to control. And that means that we will not have an absolute control of what building block comes after what building block. We will also have some chains that are shorter and some chains that are longer. So we will have a polydispersed mix of polymer chains. And these chains will also have in many cases, a random coil conformation in space. In contrast, the production of protein biopolymers is governed by the DNA of the organisms that produce those proteins. So the DNA of these organisms has the exact sequence that these protein biopolymers will have. So we know what block will come after what block, and all the proteins will have the same molecular weight, the same length. So we will have a monodispersed mix of biopolymer chains. This is very important for reproducibility, because that means that the mechanical properties of our materials will be very reproducible. It's not that it will depend on the balance between long and short chains that you have. It will be much more reproducible. And then proteins are also able to create these organized three-dimensional structures like these helices or aligned beta sheets that I mentioned in the slide before, that are key for the mechanical properties. Now, these three-dimensional structures can be important in different ways for the mechanical properties of the materials, but I'm going to show you one that applies specifically to silk. The reason why silk is at the same time able to have high strength and high toughness is represented here. So what silk does, it's able to fold a biopolymer chain into this compact structure, and this compact structure is held together by a lot of weak hydrogen bonds. So when you apply a load to silk, like for instance the impact of an insect, these beta sheets, these aligned organized regions will oppose a lot of strength against a load, against the impact of an insect. But if the load is high enough, this material, instead of breaking, what it will do is it will start breaking these reversible hydrogen bonds. So the material will still have a lot of available length to unravel and extend. So then the material will be able also to extend a lot, to form a lot. And this will be the reason why silk is also so tough. But then if you release the load, silk prefers to be in this compact way. This is the minimum energy conformation of some parts of the silk protein. So silk will want to go back to this folded compact structure. So it will refold once you remove the load. So this is why materials like silk, for instance, are able to display this combination of strength and toughness at the same time. Now, I hope with these previous slides to have convinced you that it's interesting to look at natural materials, and specifically about protein-based natural materials. But as you can imagine, the materials I've been talking about are not very easy to harvest. So it's not very easy to go to nature and start harvesting spider silk. It's also not easy to start harvesting wings from insects, or if we want to collect a lot of collagen, we would need to kill a lot of animals. So these are not very, very practical or very ethical ways of sourcing materials. But luckily, this is where life sciences and biotechnology comes into play, because what we can do now is we can produce these proteins using biotechnology and use similar approaches that we have used for centuries now to produce wine or beer, for instance. But instead of producing ethanol, we will produce these proteins. So what we will do is remember that I said before that the sequence of these proteins is encoded in the DNA of the organisms that produce them. So what we can do is we can take that part of the DNA, we can create DNA that we insert into a bacteria, and then this bacteria will go into a fermenter, into a bioreactor, and it will start producing these proteins. And then we will have to purify these proteins, and we can use them afterwards to create materials like the one that I'm showing here in this slide, which is a scaffold for tissue regeneration. But then that means if we can now use microorganisms to produce protein biopolymers instead of harvesting those biopolymers from nature, that means that we are no longer restricted to using only the designs that nature has selected for because of evolution. So we can now become much more creative and start creating our own nature-inspired protein biopolymers. So let's say that we have a protein that has a certain property A that we are interested in, and another protein in maybe a different organism for a different function that has a certain property B that is also interesting for us. So we could think of combining those two proteins into one new protein that will display both properties at the same time. So for that, we would need to take the DNA that encodes for protein A and the DNA that encodes for protein B, fuse that, and then introduce that DNA into a microorganism that will produce this new protein. This is, for instance, often done by combining elastin proteins and silk-like proteins. So I've already mentioned several times why I find silk a very interesting material, but elastin is also a very interesting biopolymer, because elastin is the second most abundant protein that we have in the human body. And it's the reason why our skin is elastic or our blood vessels are elastic. So it's a material that is able to extend and recoil during our entire lifetime without failing. If you think that in comparison to a rubber band, that after using it a lot, it becomes loose, it doesn't recover its shape anymore. But elastin doesn't do that. Elastin is able to stretch and recoil during our entire lifetime. So what we can do now is thinking about combining the elasticity of elastin plus all these nice properties from silk that I described in the slides before, and create new proteins that are termed the silk elastin-like proteins. So what we would be doing here is creating new proteins that are inspired by nature, but that do not exist in nature, to create a new material that has entirely new properties. So now, thanks to these possibilities that biotechnology provides us with, we can start combining different building blocks, making different variations, trying to see what happens if we put some blocks in the edges and some blocks in the center, or if we equally distribute these building blocks across the polymer chain in a regular fashion. And we can produce those proteins and then measure them and see which one has better mechanical properties. So for instance, here, this is a recent work that we did, and we produced 4 different proteins, and then we expressed them in bioreactors, we purified them, and then we tested their mechanical properties. In particular, I was interested in the G prime, which measures the strength of these materials. And I only saw that one of them was actually getting to high levels of G prime, which is the property that we wanted to maximize. So yeah, these are the possibilities that biotechnology is providing us with to create these new materials inspired by nature, but that do not exist in nature yet. Another thing that we can do, for instance, is to learn from microorganisms that are able to create mineral structures. And here what we did was we took inspiration from diatoms. So diatoms are unicellular microalgae that are able to create an exoskeleton of silica. So they create these beautiful structures that you can see here, and these structures are made out of silica. Now, the reason why diatoms are able to make these structures is because they express a short protein, a peptide, that is called the R5 peptide. So this peptide, what it does is it captures silicon from the environment, and it creates these silica structures. So then this led us to think, like, can we at the same time have a material that will have the mechanical properties of silk and the ability to create these beautiful silica structures of diatoms? So we created a new protein inspired both by spider silk and diatoms. We express that protein, and then we create films of that material. We put those films into solutions that had silicon, and what we saw is that indeed these materials were able to capture silicon from the environment and create these silicon nanoparticles that you can see here in these pictures. So this is yet another example of how we can take inspiration from nature, from material properties that we observe in nature, to create new materials that do not exist in nature. But as you can imagine, now our ability to combine these different building blocks from different organisms to create new materials is actually expanding our design space enormously. So much so that it's actually becoming almost untractable. So how do we know what is the best combination of building blocks? How do we know what is the best position in the polymer chain to put the different building blocks to maximize the mechanical properties of these materials? Because in the end, for us, what is important to know is how the different building blocks will fold into space. Will these proteins have these helices or these beta sheets or these turns? We need to know that to know if these new protein biopolymers will have the mechanical properties we are after. The good thing is that we can now use computation to predict how these proteins will behave before we actually synthesize those proteins. Because as you can imagine, for every new protein biopolymer that we want to produce, we have to first create the DNA with the instructions that encode for that protein, then put the DNA into a microorganism, then grow the microorganism and make it express these proteins. And then we have to find ways of purifying that protein and make the materials that we want to produce out of them. Now, many of the proteins that we might design might not have the properties that we want them to have. So you would have invested a lot of time in the lab to produce these proteins for nothing, because they will not do what you want them to do. But computation, which is also one of these factors that I mentioned at the beginning when I said that we are at a unique time now in history to develop materials, computation is able to accelerate the development of these materials by helping us predict how these materials will behave before we actually synthesize them. So we can come up with a new protein polymer sequence, which is represented by the straight line that you see on the very left of this figure. And then we can simulate this protein, see how it falls, see what three-dimensional shape it adopts in space, whether it is expanded or compact, if it has more helices or more beta sheets, if it's more hydrophobic or more hydrophilic. All these things we can study through these computational tools that we have available. And this will tell us if it's actually worth the effort trying to produce this new protein. So this is how computation can help us accelerate the development of these materials. And also now approaching the end of the presentation, I would like to briefly mention the two other factors that I described at the very beginning to the presentation. So one of them was additive manufacturing. So we can now make materials in shapes that we could not make just a few years ago. And this is because we are developing techniques like 3D printing that allow us to make materials adding layer by layer instead of having to subtract material from a larger piece. And then we are able to create complex shapes that we could not make just a few years ago. And some examples of that are shown here. On the left side, you can see a heart that was 3D printed from one protein biopolymer, which is collagen. And on the left side, you can see a silk elastin-like proteins, like the ones that I mentioned a couple of slides before, that was used to make this three-dimensional shape that was used then to study its performance as a material for tissue regeneration. And then one last thing that I would like to highlight, because I think this will have an enormous impact in the materials field in the future, is the ability not only to use microorganisms to produce these proteins, but also to incorporate the microorganisms themselves into the formulation of new materials. So the same way that from a small seed, we can a small seed can develop into a large tree, we could also dream of engineering cells and microorganisms so that they have already from the beginning the instructions that they need to actually develop into larger microstructures and create engineering living materials. I think this is a very, very exciting area of research, and yeah, I'm very excited to see how this field develops. And there are already very impressive developments being made here. So this brings me to the end of the presentation. I hope to have convinced you that nature is a great source of inspiration for developing new materials with new properties. If you want to learn more about this, I encourage you to check these two videos that I'm showing here. One of them describes a master's that we have here at UCL on nature-inspired solutions. And the other video highlights some of the work that that has been done here at the Center for Nature-Inspired Engineering at UCL over the past years. And if you have enjoyed this so much that you're actually considering studying something related to this, I encourage you to take a look at these programs that we are developing here at the Chemical Engineering, and specifically at the Nature-Inspired Solutions MSc from the Chemical Engineering Department at UCL. So this brings me to the end of the presentation. I hope to have convinced you that natural materials are impressive materials. And I hope that after seeing this presentation now, you will be able, next time that you see a natural material, to appreciate how many things we can learn from them to develop new engineering materials that will help us tackle grand challenges.